Thank you. Thank you, Professor. One of the things that, after I was out a while, that I decided I really wanted to spend more time on, because I've been focused for a long time on Iran and the threat that it represents to the state, this regime represents to the world. But I wanted to work more closely with the National Council of Resistance in Iran and the so-called MEK, and I'm very pleased to be able to do that. This is not a case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The people in the Iranian-American community and the global Iranian community who are fighting the regime in Tehran are our friends. And I'm very glad that all of you are here today. I want to say how pleased I am to be with the Iranian Americans who are here, and frankly, to note the presence of a number of Senate staff members, perhaps some from the House, something that I could never acknowledge during the 24 years I was in the Senate. The staff is actually quite important and help the senators and congressmen to make a lot of the important decisions about what's a priority. So the fact that you're here means a lot. Happy Nowruz to everyone. I have been in this room, SDG 50, at least 100 times for hearings over the years, maybe 200. And I will tell you flat out, I have never seen it looking better and more beautiful than it does today. So my compliments to anyone responsible for that. This scene is really magnificent and reminds us, as others have said, about the history and proud culture of Iran, and the fact that this great country and this great people, educated, civilized people, are essentially being held captive by a tyrannical, despotic regime. Because of the importance of stopping the radical extremist regime in Iran from getting nuclear weapons, we've all been naturally focused on the negotiations between the P5+1 and Iran. The president has said, President Obama said, no deal is better than a bad deal, and we ought to make sure that Congress has the power through Corker-Menendez to reject that bad deal. They have masterfully manipulated the United States and the other members of the P5+1 to a point where I think they have concluded, the Iranian regime has concluded, that we want an agreement much more than they do. And as anybody who's ever been involved in negotiations of any kind knows, that's a bad place to be. Why are we so fearful of the Islamic Republic of Iran getting nuclear weapons? That's what I really want to focus on today. Obviously, it's bad in itself when nuclear weapons proliferate in the world, but I want to focus on the government that is involved in the most horrific and also aggressive human rights violations in the Middle East, stifling democracy and fueling the sectarian conflict throughout the region. And that, of course, is the Islamic Republic of Iran. Let me talk about human rights first. Today, there are at least 900 political prisoners in jails in Iran, people who are there for no other reason than they express their political opinion. The UN reports that at least 753 individuals were executed by the current Iranian government in 2014, last year. That's the highest total in a dozen years. And as many of you know, executions have occurred at a far more rapid pace since the self-proclaimed moderate Hassan Rouhani became president than they did under his predecessor Ahmadinejad. What about gender equality? Well, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has called gender equality, and I quote, one of the biggest mistakes of Western thought. I guess he's not too happy about the National Council of Resistance, or the MEK, because it happens to be led by a great woman, Mrs. Rajavi. So Iran treats women as second-class citizens. They can't enter public stadiums. They must adhere to dress codes. They face restricted access to employment. They can be forced into marriage as children. This is an extraordinarily gifted group of people who are pushed out of the mainstream of society. In one recent high-profile case of just extreme abuse, the Tehran government executed a 26-year-old woman for killing a man who was attempting to rape her. This is primeval. And what about the internet? The internet is just plain blocked. Google is blocked, Wikipedia is blocked, Amazon is blocked, we could go on and on, YouTube. A group called Reporters Without Borders that monitors this kind of behavior called Iran an enemy of the internet. And in 2013 said that they were the worst country in the world in freedom of the internet. Why do they do this? These are not acts of strength or security by the government. These are acts of weakness and insecurity by the regime that currently governs a great country, Iran. They're afraid of the people. Their people. They're afraid of their people talking to each other. They're afraid of their people going on the internet and finding out what's happening in the rest of the world. Let me just say a few words, but you know it so well, I'm going to be brief on this. Iran obviously remains the leading state sponsor of global terrorism, and that global terrorism has been its #1 instrument for extending its power. I mean, hegemony is a phrase that people don't like to use anymore, but this is a country that wants to become an empire, a caliphate, a hegemonic power. Iran supports Hezbollah, the Lebanon-based terrorist organization that has killed more Americans than any terror group except al-Qaeda. During the Iraq War, Iran's trained, armed, supported Shiite militias that killed, that is Iraqi Shia militias, that killed hundreds of Americans, often with a type of Iranian manufactured IED that was far deadlier than anything the militias could have built themselves. Iran's fingerprints can be found on terror plots across the world, as you know, even in Washington, D.C., where it sought to assassinate the Saudi ambassador in 2011 at the Cafe Milano here, which we had thought until that time was a sanctuary, but apparently not so. Notwithstanding their alleged Sunni-Shia theological difference, Iran has provided support and shelter to elements of al-Qaeda. Listen to the 9/11 Commission report. Quote, the relationship between al-Qaeda and Iran demonstrated that Sunni-Shia divisions did not necessarily pose an insurmountable barrier to cooperation in terrorist operations, end of quote. And of course, Iran's regional ambitions go far beyond terror plots. We've seen perhaps one of the greatest atrocities, genocide, go on with the rest of the world, essentially standing by passively in Syria since March of 2011, fueled primarily by the Iranian government. We know what's happening with the Islamic State in Iraq now. It provides Iran with the opportunity to pursue its own agenda there. And there and elsewhere in the region lately, Qasem Soleimani, of the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, is publicly on the battlefield, directing those troops in Syria, in Iraq. Don't be surprised if he turns up in Yemen or Afghanistan soon. Already these militias have committed atrocities in fighting against Sunni majority areas once held by ISIS. That's why retired General Dave Petraeus has said that the foremost threat to Iraq's long-term stability is not the Islamic State. Rather, it is Shiite militias, many backed by and some directly guided by Iran. Now, I know that you agree with me that this is an abysmal record of human rights violations and terrorist killings sponsored by the Islamic Republic of Iran. How could we, with our eyes open and our heads working, think that we can negotiate an agreement for them to stop their nuclear weapons program that we can rely on? Because just look at who we're negotiating with. Just today in the paper, Mr. Yukiya Amano, who's the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, a unit of the United Nations, not part of the West or part of America, the UN. Amano said today that in 12 areas where he was commissioned to ask questions to Iran, the government has, on their nuclear weapons program, the government has only given him answers on one. And therefore, he cannot certify or guarantee or even encourage any belief that they would keep an agreement with the United States. Now, to me, one of the most perverse arguments being made now is that if there is an agreement on nuclear weapons with Iran, that will pave the way to a broader strategic reorientation by Tehran, which ideally would include an abandonment of its hegemonic ambitions in the region, an abandonment of its terrorist proxies, and an end to its human rights abuses. Does anyone really believe that? That's almost, I have trouble asking the question. And here I want to just take a moment to talk about Camp Liberty. Starting in 1986, this organization was headquartered at Camp Ashraf in Iraq until 2012, when it was relocated to a small section of Camp Liberty, which is directly east of the Baghdad International Airport. Camp Liberty had been built and maintained by the U.S. Army until the departure of most of our forces in 2011. Shortly after the coalition invasion of Iraq in 2003, all the residents of Ashraf, again, Iranian dissidents, I would say freedom fighters, were provided written assurances of protected person status under the Fourth Geneva Convention if certain actions were taken on the part of the residents. And all of them were taken. They met every expectation that we, the United States government, placed on them. Unfortunately, in 2009, the protected person status was revoked summarily, arbitrarily, without cause. And the residents, their security, was turned over to the Iraqi government at the time, which was heavily influenced by Tehran, which would like nothing better than to take violent action against these enemies of theirs, because they're fighters for freedom in Ashraf. There's a lot more I could say about that, but let me just say, as we work hard here on Capitol Hill and elsewhere to liberate the people who are trapped in Camp Liberty, we owe them. And I promise you that I will do everything I can to make sure that the United States does everything it can to keep its word. So let me say, in summary, and speak to you directly, those of you who fight and work so hard in this movement. You may occasionally ask yourselves, how can the movement of events going in such a terrible direction in the country that means so much to you and should mean so much to everybody who fights for freedom and cares about it, be stopped? And the answer, I think, is that it can be stopped by good and courageous people who are prepared to fight to stop it. The people of Iran, typified and represented in many ways by the National Council of Resistance in Iran, are really the answer. As much as I know you believe in your cause, even you must sometimes ask yourself, is it possible, can the regime in Iran, with all its weapons, all its money, and the control it has over its people internally, really be stopped and overthrown? And I say to you today, based not just on faith, but on history, yes, the regime in Iran can be overthrown, and I believe it will be soon. Margaret Mead, the great anthropologist, once said, never underestimate the capacity of a small group of devoted, ordinary citizens to change the world. In fact, she said, indeed, it's the only way that has ever happened. I'll go back to the beginning of American history when Thomas Paine, one of our great patriots, a leader of the revolution, said to his fellow revolutionaries, probably at a moment when they themselves were doubting whether they could overturn the British Empire. It was unthinkable. And in words that echo right down to us today, Thomas Paine said, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again," end quote. And against all odds, as we know, thank God they did. The independent nation of America was created. The world did begin all over again on July 4th, 1776, committed its government to securing the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that didn't come from the government, but came from the Creator. I was greatly influenced, probably in some ways catalyzed into public service by President Kennedy, John F. Kennedy. For most of you here, probably weren't even born or even a thought in your parents' minds. But it was a great time in 1960. The Kennedy inaugural address is worth reading. It's a call to a generation. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. I quote, "The same revolutionary beliefs for which our forebears fought are still at issue." And of course, they still are, and nowhere more than in Iran, are still at issue around the globe. The belief that the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. And then he went on to say, to commit our country and tell our friends and our foes, which I wish we would do again right now, that the United States would, quote, "pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the success and survival of liberty." In his time, I'm giving you these historic examples to tell you that when I say that regime in Iran is going to collapse, I'm not just sort of blowing smoke, as we used to say up here in Capitol Hills. I say to you today that the evil empire of the Islamic Republic of Iran will be vanquished in our time, and the world will begin anew. And part of why that will happen is because of the principle, the devotion, the steadfastness, the courage, the intellectual energy, the remarkable intelligence work done in Iran by the National Council of Resistance, led, as I mentioned briefly earlier, by Ms. Rajavi, who is a remarkable figure in her own right and a powerful figure, strong, gifted, modern, religious, and clearly tolerant. And what a message to the Ayatollah and the other mullahs that she happens to be a woman. And what a change that would be. But I want to close by repeating something I said on that occasion. It was an honor to speak to that group. Histories and heroes in this room, and I add in this room too, tell me that the future does not belong to despots and dictators. It belongs to activists from Tehran, journalists from Moscow, bloggers from Cairo, human rights advocates from North Korea, and to countless others whose names are not yet known, but which will someday be inscribed alongside those of Havel and Sharansky in the kingdom of conscience and courage in which all freedom fighters belong. Dear friends, I wish you a happy Nowruz. I know Nowruz means new day. With you, I pray that this is the year in which, and I pray with faith, that this is the year when we will see not just a new day in Iran, but a new government that will reflect and represent and protect the people of this great country. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.